This is Tony Blazier for the Motocross Vault presented by Blinzall. If you're in the market for some high quality racing oil for your two-stroke or four, make sure you go to blinzall.com and use our discount code VAULT20 to save 20% at checkout. Thank you for all the support.
Hi, this is Jim Holly and welcome to the Motocross Vault.
Hello and welcome back to the Motocross Vault. My name is Tony Blazier, and what this video is going to cover is a look back at one of the more popular enduro machines of the late 70s and early 80s, Suzuki's PE175. Now, the Japanese have an interesting relationship with the enduro class. Unlike the motocross divisions where they've pretty much stayed involved the whole time, they kind of dipped their toe in and dipped their toe out of the enduro market. But the late 70s and early 80s were really a good time to be in the Japanese enduro market because they are all supporting it heavily. In 1977, Suzuki had come out with their first pure enduro, the PE, which was a 250, the PE 250 that year. And a year later, they came out with a 175 version. Eventually, they would add a 400 as well, before contracting everything back down to the 175. And eventually, unfortunately, putting it out to retirement in 1984. So the PE 175 was basically in their lineup from 78 to 84. At the time, the Europeans were still kind of the king of the enduro market, much as they are today with KTM and what have you. KTM was a major power back then in the 70s even, although here in the US, most of them were known as Pentons. But, you know, brands like KTM, Can-Am at the time, which does like four-wheelers and stuff now mainly, but, you know, enduro machines at the time. And the Japanese were just kind of getting involved in it. Honda had come out with one which was, you know, fairly mediocre. Yamaha had really kind of broken the ice with the IT 175, which had been an excellent value. It cost, you know, in many cases less than half what some of the Europeans cost at the time. A good machine. And then in Suzuki's case, they got involved in 1978. Now this one's going to look at, basically as I've done in the previous ones that I've gone back, and I'm going to look at them year by year, talk a little bit about the competition in each year, because again, the Japanese were heavily involved in the enduro market at the time. You had Honda coming in with the XR series in 1979. You had the KDXs got introduced in 1980. And then, of course, Yamaha had the IT and Suzuki had the PE. So all four of the major manufacturers had enduro bikes. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other videos I've done on the channel. I've done a history of the Honda XR200, history of the XR250, and the XR500 / 600. I've also done histories of other machines like the CR lineup, the CR250, and the CR80, and what have you. So if you like this sort of history and the look back of the different models, how they change year over year, check out my channel for many other videos. If you'd like to support what I do here, I just came out with a new design using a little mini truck. I think all of us who rode had little mini trucks at some point, although they've kind of gone out of style now. I love mini trucks. Makes it so much easier to get stuff in and out of. And I thought it might be fun to take some of the classics like the Toyota here. This is one's based on our 1976 Toyota. I plan on doing a Datsun, maybe an S10 Ranger, all the little trucks we all used to use to haul our bikes around, and incorporate that into some designs. So this first one uses a 1976 Toyota. And then I put a little 1980 Mike Bell style Yamaha in the back of it. And you can find it. It's live on my Teespring store right now. And the link will be in the description below if you'd like to support what I do here and check it out. So here's the story of the Suzuki PE175 from its introduction in 1978 through its retirement in 1984. Originally launched in 1978, the PE175 was Suzuki's answer to Yamaha's popular IT175. At the time, the 175 Enduro class was just starting to heat up, with the established contenders from Can-Am and Penton just starting to be legitimately challenged by the Japanese. In 1975, Honda introduced their entry into the 175 class with their MR175. Based loosely on their incredibly popular CR125M, the MR was a capable trail bike, but not much of a performance player. It was badly underpowered compared to its competition, and not much of a threat to machines like Penton's Jack Piner. 2 years later, in 1977, Yamaha threw their hat into the 125 Enduro ring by introducing a small bore version of their 400cc International Trials model. Once again based on a 125 motocrosser, the new IT175 proved incredibly popular with its advanced monoshock rear suspension and a rock-bottom price of $998. This sum was half what some of the IT's competition were charging at the time, and a screaming deal to anyone looking for a lightweight woods machine. In 1978, Suzuki entered the 175 fray by following Honda and Yamaha's model and raiding their 125 parts bin. The all-new Pure Enduro 175 featured a frame and motor based off the usually popular 76 RM125A. Both the RM and P shared the same 30-degree steering angle and 130 millimeters of trail. This geometry was less aggressive than the latest RM125 offered in 1978, but it was deemed more suitable for the PE's intended purpose. The overall dimensions of the frames were nearly identical, but the PE did feature a smaller diameter swing arm in the rear and the use of mild steel instead of the RM's tough chromoly steel for its construction. In the switch to off-road use, extra tabs were also added to the frame for the needed Enduro hardware, and a loop was welded to the rear to secure the PE's larger rear fender. On the motor side, the PE175 featured a bored and stroked version of the air-cooled power reed motor employed in the RM125. In use since 1976, the power reed consisted of a hybrid piston port and reed valve induction setup that looked to combine the advantages of both to provide the widest possible spread of power. In addition to offering more displacement, the new PE mill featured beefed-up components throughout. Both the connecting rod and crank pin were enlarged, with the small and big end bearings also receiving an upgrade in size. The wrist pin was increased by 2 mm in diameter, and the piston skirt was lengthened to increase the reliability and prevent rocking within the cylinder. With the increase in bore and stroke, the PE's overall displacement was bumped up to a full 172 cc. The porting was also exclusive to the Enduro model, with a new profile favoring low-end torque over the motocrosser's shrieking revs. Both machines shared the same 32mm Mikuni VM32SS carburetor and Suzuki's pointless electronic ignition, but the PE did feature a new external rotor flywheel to provide additional mass and enough juice to power a set of lights. To be certified as EPA legal, the PE had to meet strict sound standards, so both the airbox and exhaust were far more restricted than the units found on the RM. This helped make the PE more waterproof, but it did nothing to assist the bike's power. The PE's exhaust system featured a baffle midway down its expansion chamber and a very restrictive spark-arrested silencer. This helped make the bike very quiet and kept Smokey the Bear happy, but it also severely neutered the stock machine's performance. In the bottom end, the PE175 once again used a set of modified RM cases. Many internal parts were interchangeable, but the PE did feature a wider set of ratios to better suit its off-road aspirations. Many of the clutch components were also interchangeable, but the PE's clutch did feature 2 additional plates for improved durability. With its wide ratio gearbox, top speed was set at an RM dusting 69 miles per hour. The bodywork on the new PE was similar in looks to the RM, but the Enduro version did feature larger fenders, a 3.2-gallon tank, which was nearly double the capacity of what was found on the RM, as well as lights both front and rear. Remarkably, overall suspension travel remained very close to the travel offered on the Motocross model, with 9.1 inches up front and a full 9 inches in the rear. This was in direct contrast to machines like the IT175, which lopped a full 2 inches off the travel offered on their YZ125. While the suspension travel was very similar, the two machines did not actually share the same components. Up front, the PE lacked the RM's air-assisted fork caps, and in the rear, the shocks did not enjoy the same remote reservoirs found on the Motocross model. Internally, both the springs and damping settings were also much softer than those employed on the RM. On the trail, the new PE turned out to be an excellent performer in every category but one. Its RM-based chassis and long travel suspension provided one of the best handling packages in the class. Its turning manners were very good in the woods, and everyone praised its light feel and excellent ergonomics. That feel was not just an illusion either, as the PE tipped the scales at a very light 216 pounds. That made it the lightest bike in the class, and helped every facet of the PE's handling. Both the forks and shock were ultra plush and well suited to plonking down the trail or snaking through the trees at speed. The long travel suspension also gave it over a 2-inch ground clearance advantage over the IT, with the Suzuki gliding over obstacles that the Yamaha bashed into. If high-speed desert work was in the cards, then the PE suspension was likely to be too soft, but for most traditional enduro applications, the little Suzuki was an excellent choice. Where the PE's domination went somewhat astray was in the motor category. Mostly because of its absurdly choked-off exhaust, the PE was badly underpowered compared to its rivals. In 1978, nothing was close to the power being pumped out by Can-Am's rocket-fast rotary valve Rotax, but even compared to the IT-175, the PE was a 216-pound weakling. On the dyno, it gave up a whopping 3.3 horsepower to the Yamaha and almost 5 horsepower to its smaller RM125 brother. On the bright side, the PE was far torquier than the IT, and it was very pleasant on the trail. Tight trees, rocks, and roots were in its wheelhouse, and there the PE excelled. Once the trail opened up, however, the stock PE was likely to be left in the dust. When Cycle magazine tested both the Yamaha and Suzuki in 1978, the Yamaha pulled a 5 to 6 bike length advantage every time through the gears. On steep hills and in wide open fast sections, this power deficiency was very noticeable, but in the woods, it was less of a hindrance. Thankfully, this power inadequacy was easily addressed by ditching the stock pipe and silencer for something more free-breathing. This did make the bike a bit louder, but it also really woke up its power band. Overall, the 1978 PE175 was an excellent first effort for Suzuki, and by far the most competitive enduro machine offered up to that point by the Japanese. There were certainly faster machines available, and ones with a more storied pedigree, but if you were looking for the best do-it-all small-bore enduro at a reasonable price, you could not go wrong with the PE175. For 1979, the small-bore enduro market got even more interesting with the return of Honda to the class. After 2 years off, Big Red was back with a new 4-stroke designed to do battle in the woods. The all-new XR185 featured a rugged 2-valve motor, dual shocks, and a suite of full enduro hardware. Not at all related to its 2-stroke motocross brethren this time. The new XR was easily the most unique machine available in the 1979 small-bore enduro class. While the new XR185 was not much of a powerhouse, its meager 15.02 horsepower actually put it pretty close to the stock output of the 78 PE. Knowing this power deficiency was a main complaint of riders the year before, Suzuki set about uncorking their 175 somewhat for 1979. First to go was the overly baffled pipe, which had been the main culprit in the 78 model's meager top-end performance. In its place, Suzuki installed a new quote-unquote fuzzy-walled expansion chamber that replaced the solid baffle of 78 with a new layer of mesh encircling the interior of the pipe. The hope was that this new mesh design would provide the same level of sound deadening as the 78 model without the penalties in its power output. In addition to the new pipe, Suzuki also installed an all-new carburetor for 79. The new mixer grew from 32mm to 34mm and aimed to cajole a bit more top-end power out of the motor's 172cc. Lastly, the engineers upped the weight of the crank slightly to boost the PE's chug factor for 79. On the chassis front, the PE remained largely unchanged, but there were a few upgrades aimed at making the bike more race-ready. Chief among these was a redesigned rear axle that incorporated a quick change feature for the first time. The 78 model's motocross-style adjusters were replaced with a new snail-type unit that made trail-side adjustments much easier. In terms of actual performance, the changes made for 79 were a bit of a mixed bag, however. The new pipe did perform slightly better on top, but the PE continued to be pretty flat through the middle and actually worse down low. The new larger carburetor proved difficult to jet cleanly, and many testers believe that the bike actually ran better with the smaller mixer. The heavier crank and poor jetting muted the bike's low-end response, and most riders actually preferred the snappier 78 power plant. Once again, ditching the stock exhaust and fiddling with the jetting helped immensely, but the PE remained a great bike in need of a few more ponies. Other than the motor, the Suzuki's performance remained largely unchanged. Fast guys thought the suspension was too soft, but most log hoppers liked its performance. The bike's handling split the difference between turning and stability nicely, and the machine's controls and overall feel were praised for their comfort. On the demerit side were the PE's continued use of a non-folding brake and shift lever, which seemed a very curious addition to a machine designed for enduro use, its water-flummoxing brakes, which were completely useless once they were wet, and power-robbing exhaust. Overall, the 79 PE175 was still very competitive, but with additional competition on the horizon, Suzuki's smallest enduro would need to really step up its game if it had any intention of staying at the front. For 1980, the 175 division got even more crowded with the introduction of Kawasaki's new entry, the groundbreaking KDX 175. Based on the all-new monoshock KX125, the KDX featured a cutting-edge chassis, powerful motor, and the most sophisticated rear suspension in the class. Its new Unitrack single-shock rear suspension and KX-style Kayaba forks provided nearly 10 inches of excellent travel, and the all-new 173cc motor pumped out a stump-thumping 24 horsepower. With its strong motor, state-of-the-art suspension, and motocross-level chassis, the KDX felt far more serious than any of its rivals. It was a potent machine made for going fast in the woods. In addition to the new Kawasaki, the PE also had to contend with a completely redesigned IT-175 for 1980. After several years of short-legged machines, Yamaha finally upgraded the suspension on the IT to match most of the performance found on the latest YZ125. An all-new monoshock with a huge remote reservoir and external rebound adjustability was taken directly off the YZ line and paired with a set of all-new air-adjustable 36mm Kayaba forks. With just short of 10 inches of travel front and rear, the new IT was right back in the ballpark with its rivals. Not content to get blown off the trail in 1980, Suzuki was also back with an all-new 175 designed to go toe-to-toe with its enduro competition. Visually, the bike was largely unchanged aside from a set of new FIM legal side plates and a slightly smaller fuel tank. These changes improved the PE's ergonomics and freshened up its appearance. While the new side plates did give the bike more of a motocross look, the jury was still out in 1980 as to whether or not this was actually an improvement over the old machine's more purposeful appearance. Underneath the slightly stale bodywork, there was an all-new chassis that maintained the DualShock arrangement of 79, but added a beefy alloy swing arm and all-new Kayaba shocks that upped the travel to 9.7 inches. The front forks were also new and added air adjustability for the first time. Travel was increased 0.74 inches to a total of 9.84 inches of available movement. This put it right in line with the all-new IT and KDX. The chassis geometry was altered for 1980 to improve the PE steering as well. While most riders liked the old bike's handling, some had complained of a bit of front-end push in loose conditions. Overall chassis strength was greatly increased as well, with a move away from the mild steel of the previous PE design to the same chromoly steel used on the RMs. With this move to a larger fork, the steering stem was also enlarged to better handle the forces the longer travel suspension was likely to subject the frame to. Complementing the revised frame was an all-new motor for 1980. In an effort to pull the PE out of the horsepower doghouse, Suzuki's engineers ditched the complete top end of the 79 machine and bolted on an all-new cylinder and head for 1980. The exhaust system was redesigned as well and tuned to allow the PE to breathe better without being too obnoxious on the sound front. The bore, stroke, and displacement remained unchanged, however, at 62 by 57 millimeters for a total of 172 cc's. On the dyno, all of these changes added up to a massive 25% increase in horsepower for 1980. The redesigned engine pumped out 4.56 more horsepower than before, and even outclassed the RM125 in 1980. That put it right up there with powerhouses like the KDX, and easily outpaced the rather disappointing power plant found in the redesigned IT. Low-end response was much improved for 80, with the McCuney carburetor offering much cleaner jetting than the year before. The PE was still no stump puller, but it was more than adequate to pull you through the tight sections. Both the mid-range and top end were greatly improved, with the PE no longer falling off a power cliff if you tried to rev it out. This made it much easier to catch the next gear on long climbs, and did mitigate the annoying hesitation previous machines had suffered from when shifting to the upper gears under a load. On the chassis side, the new PE was also much improved, but the competition was quickly surpassing the limits of its older design. Both the forks and shocks were stiff and harsh compared to the ultra-plush Kawasaki and trail-gobbling IT. The bulging dual shocks also detracted from the feel of the Suzuki compared to the slim layouts found in the monoshock competition. New items like a side-pull throttle and an improved quick-change wheel were appreciated, but the continued lack of a folding tip for the shift lever and brakes started to feel like a plot to support the aftermarket by 1980. With its newfound power, it was once again a contender, but if you were looking for the best 175 available in 1980, the smart money was on green. For 1981, the PE, KDX, and IT were all back with only minor updates. All three featured an array of refinements, but no major changes. In the small bore Enduro class, the only really big news was the arrival of Honda's all-new ProLink XR200R. While still down significantly on power compared to its rivals, the new XR offered one of the most advanced chassis in the class. Its advanced ProLink suspension and gutsy motor made it a viable Enduro mount in the tighter eastern events, and the little XR started to garner quite a cult following among those who prize reliability and ease of use over outright power. In the case of the Suzuki PE175, most of the changes for 81 were not apparent to the naked eye. Aside from a slight tweaking of the graphics and the deletion of a skid plate, the 80 and 81 models appeared visually identical. Instead of a skid plate, the 81 PE received a set of bash bars welded to the frame. These were lighter and less prone to becoming clogged with mud, but did afford less protection to the bottom of the motor. Depending on the type of riding you were doing, this may or may not have been an issue. Other than the deletion of the skid plate, the most significant changes for 81 were a 1mm lowering of the exhaust port, a thicker head gasket, and a slight revision to the exhaust system. The jetting was also leaned out slightly to match the new porting, and a set of split perches were added to aid servicing. On the chassis front, there were no real changes for 81. This meant the PE still used the same non-adjustable gas-charged dual shocks and 36mm air-oil assisted forks. As in 80, these units were rather stiffly sprung and harsh on small rocks and roots. This did make the PE more suitable for western work, but it detracted from its appeal as an eastern machine. Both the KDX and IT offered a much smoother ride that offered much more comfort on the trail. On the motor front, the PE remained a solid performer. As in the year before, the KDX was still the powerhouse of the class, but the PE was closer than ever. The minor motor mods beefed up the low end slightly, and the mill was even more responsive than before. Snappy, torquey, and reasonably powerful, it was an excellent enduro power plant. With its short wheelbase and aggressive geometry, the PE continued to handle very well in the trees, but it did suffer somewhat at speed compared to the longer and better suspended Kawasaki. Neither machine was really the hot setup for bombing across the desert, but if the occasional hare and hound was in your future, you were likely to be happier on the green machine. By 1981, the bodywork and overall feel of the PE was also starting to show its age. The wide and square tank, short seat, and bulging side panels all felt old-fashioned compared to the much more modern Honda and Kawasaki layouts. No one particularly liked the bend of the bars as well, but that was a pretty easy fix. Overall, the PE was a great 70s machine up against 80s competition. It made a decent clubman racer and a very fun trail bike, but if winning at the top level was your aim, there were better machines available in 1981. For 1982, Suzuki decided to contract its US PE lineup by discontinuing both the PE250 and PE400. Apparently neither model had proven nearly as popular as the 175 in America, so Suzuki made the decision to put all of their eggs in the smaller machine's basket for 82. Thankfully, with this renewed focus came a much improved machine. In terms of the competition, the PE's main foes for 82 remained the Kawasaki KDX 175 and Yamaha IT 175. After taking the top crown of 175 in 81, the KDX was back with only minor changes, while the Yamaha marched into 82 with an all-new design. The lovable XR200 was back as well, but bold new graphics and some minor damping updates were not enough to overcome its relative lack of power compared to its rivals. In the case of the PE, Suzuki came up to the plate in 1982 with a complete redesign of the chassis on their 175 Enduro. This all-new design incorporated Suzuki's revolutionary full floater rear suspension system for the first time, and finally brought the PE up to date with its single-shock rivals. Introduced in 1981 on the Motocross line, the full floater consisted of a single large damper connected to the frame and swing arm by a set of pull rods and bell crank linkages. By having a linkage at both the top and bottom of the shock, the full floater allowed the shock to be isolated from the rest of the chassis and float independently. In Suzuki's estimation, this design would allow the suspension to be more responsive by keeping the angle of the shock consistent, thus preventing binding as it moved through its travel. In 1981, the RM's full floater suspension had proved to be the best performing of all the new linkage-equipped systems, so its appearance on the PE175 was a welcome addition. The PE175's new frame was once again constructed out of tough chromoly steel and featured a slightly steeper geometry for 82. In order to improve steering precision, the angle of the head was pulled in 1.5 degrees, and the diameter of the forks were increased from 36mm to 38mm. This was the same size as found in the RM125 in 1982. The all-new forks provided 10.6 inches of travel and offered air caps as their only external adjustment. In the rear, the all-new full floater offered the same 10.6 inches of movement as the front forks, with external adjustments available for spring preload and 4 selectable rebound settings. To further improve handling and overall feel, the PE's rider compartment was also redesigned for 82, with a longer saddle and a slimmer tank and seat. This made it easier to slide forward and weight the front wheel in turns, and aided comfort on long rides. New straight pull hubs were taken from the Motocross line to increase wheel strength and improve braking feel. As in 1981, the rear wheel offered Suzuki's excellent quick change capability. On the motor front, most of the improvements were due to the PE's redesigned airbox. The new box offered a larger overall volume and an improved breathing for 1982. Internally, the only changes to the motor were new ratios for 3rd through 6th gear. All three were lowered slightly in an effort to further reduce the bog that riders had complained about on the previous models. To compensate for the new lower ratios, the final drive was altered as well, with a switch from a 48-tooth sprocket to a 46 in the rear. On the trail, all of these changes added up to an all-new experience on the PE175. Overall motor performance was improved slightly, but the new gearing was too tall for anything other than wide-open trails. In the woods, the bike required much more clutch abuse, and the bike responded much better if you went back to the 81's larger rear sprocket. Once this was done, the PE offered the Goldilocks version of an Enduro power band. It did not have as much grunt as the Kawasaki, or as much rev as the Yamaha, but it offered the best mid-range, and just enough at the extremes to make it one of the best do-it-all engines in the class. As with previous Suzukis, the shifting remained rather notchy, but the new ratios made better use of the bike's available power. Overall, it was an excellent small-bore Enduro motor. On the chassis front, the PE was once again a very able handler in the woods. The new stronger frame gave the bike a very RM-like feel that was a major improvement in every way over the old machine. The PE turned very well and could cut under every other machine except for the super short wheelbase XR. The new larger forks and beefed up frame also gave the bike a very solid feel that was confidence-inspiring at speed. The forks' performance was excellent for most riders, but really fast guys did find them a bit soft. For them, an increase in oil level helped immensely. Out back, everyone loved the performance of the new full floater rear suspension. As on the RMs, the full floater PE could be charged into obstacles that would give men on lesser machines pause. It gobbled up logs and roots with ease and absorbed whoops with nary a whimper. After two fairly disappointing outings in 80 and 81, the PE175 was officially back in contention with a majorly improved machine. Nice enduro features like the simplest quick change wheel in the class, a set of on-the-fly brake and clutch adjusters, and finally a set of folding tips for the brake and shift lever made the bike one of the most race-ready machines in the class. Once you geared it down and dialed in the forks, the 82 PE175 was easily the best Suzuki Enduro offering since the original in 1978. After the complete redesign of 1982, the PE175 was back for 83 with a modest list of updates. Visually, the machine was very similar, with a slight update to the graphics, a new blue seat, and a yellow set of fork stanchions being the only giveaway that you bought the latest model. In terms of actual performance, the only significant changes were another rejiggering of the transmission's internal ratios and a switch back to the lower final drive of 1981. This was done to alleviate the clutch frying and belly aching riders had displayed in 1982 when they had tried to ride the bike with the stock gearing and found it a frustrating experience. In 1983, the hubs were also slightly upgraded with a new seal to try and keep water out a little better for the new year. Other than these minor updates, the PE175 was basically the same solid performer it had been the year before. While Suzuki was content with refinements for 83, its biggest enduro competitor was back with an all-new machine designed to bury its off-road competition. In 1982, the KDX 175 had maintained its lead as the torquer of the class, with a strong bottom-end motor that pulled harder and sooner than its rivals. Compared to the all-new IT and PE, its chassis was a bit outdated, but it did still make a viable mount for those who did not want to ride the clutch all day long and scream the motor from check to check. For 1983, Kawasaki put those chassis doldrums in the rearview mirror with a complete redesign of the KDX. Bumping the displacement up to a full 198 cc's, the rechristened KDX 200 romped on its competition with a burly blast of power that easily bested its rivals. The additional displacement gave the bike an advantage at every point in the power curve and made a huge difference in the rideability of the machine. The all-new chassis was a solid performer as well, but the redesigned Unitrack was still not as supple on the trail as the Suzuki's PE full floater. As to the PE, that suspension remained its most significant advantage over its rivals. The new transmission ratios for 83 spread out its power, but made the bike slower to rev and more tame feeling. Considering it was not really a rocket to begin with, this was not much of an improvement. Its 230-pound weight was 15 pounds porkier than the new KDX as well, thus further handicapping its forward thrust potential. As in previous years, the PE was certainly capable of winning in the right hands, but its excellent suspension and solid handling were no longer enough to keep it at the front versus its much lighter and stronger competition. In 1984, the beloved PE175 entered into what would become its swan song season with only a set of new factory graphics and a more waterproof throttle to account for its $49 increase in cost over 1983. While the PE was mechanically identical to the year before, the move to blue for the frame and fork boots brightened up the bike's appearance considerably and gave the illusion that the Suzuki 175 was more changed than it actually was. Aside from the blue paint, there was a set of new yellow plastic guards for the lower forks, which were no longer painted yellow, and some updated graphics. Other than that, the 84 PE was more or less an 82 model with a slightly different set of gearing. While this was not necessarily a bad thing, the competition did get decidedly steeper in 84 with the complete redesign of the IT and XR. Both machines were greatly upgraded, with a bump in displacement for the IT bringing it up to a 200 for 1984. This left the Suzuki with the smallest motor and the oldest chassis in the class. While neither of these really detracted from the machine's fun factor, it was clear that Suzuki was no longer interested in continuing to develop their Enduro line. After 7 years of production, the fun and feisty PE175 was finally put out to pasture at the end of the 1984 season. So there you have it. That's a look back at the history of the Suzuki PE175, a machine that wasn't maybe always the best machine in its class, but it was always definitely one of the contenders. Some years better than others, but overall, I think a machine that most people think very fondly of. A friend of mine had one, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago when I had my KDX 200, and I putted it around a little bit. It felt much smaller than the KDX at the time. I think my KDX was maybe an 01. So obviously, big difference. But, the P wasn't like terribly slow. It was, a torquey, fun little bike to ride. And I think even in the 70s there, it was a, pretty fun little machine. And depending on, who you were competing against and what level you were competing, it was certainly a machine that was capable of winning. So Again, machine I wish Suzuki still built. Unfortunately, if you're looking for a little two-stroke enduro, the only options you have are you got, I guess, the YZ125X, and then you got to go European, which is KTM, Gascast, whoever like that. I do wish the Japanese would get back into this business where they'd build these little two-stroke enduros. I had a KDX 200, had a KTM 200, the EXC, and my God, that bike was fun. It's just an awesome little motorcycle. And people think a two-stroke can't be tractable like a four-stroke. They've never ridden one of those KTM 200s because that thing was like a trials bike down low, and it felt like a 125 when you got it out in the open. Great do-it-all machine. Another machine that I think KTM would be wise to bring back out. Great little motorcycle. So again, if you like this sort of thing, check out some of the other stuff I've done. If you like to support the channel, you can find the link in my description below for my Teespring stuff, for Motocross Vault merch. And if you could like, share, and subscribe on social media, tell your friends about the channel, I would very much appreciate that as well. So until we meet again, this is Tony Blazier for the Motocross Vault. Keep the rubber side down. Peace.